Every single year, without fail, the world dies a little. The leaves fall. The fields turn brown and bare. The warmth drains slowly out of the air, and the earth, so recently full of green and growing things, goes still and cold and silent for months at a time. And then, just as reliably, just when the cold has come to feel permanent, the world is born again. The green returns. The birds come back. The frozen ground softens, and life pours back into it, as though it had never truly left at all. We call this the changing of the seasons, and we have grown so used to it that we rarely stop to ask the strange and simple question at its heart. Why does the world need to die at all, even for a little while, before it can live again? The Greeks asked exactly this question 3,000 years ago, and the answer they found was not written in the stars or the soil. It was written in the story of a mother's grief, a daughter's disappearance, and a small handful of seeds that would divide the entire year between darkness and light forever. To understand it, we must go back to a time before winter existed at all, to a world that had never once known the cold. In the earliest days, the old stories tell us, the earth knew only one season, and it was an endless spring. The reason for this was simple. The goddess who ruled over the harvest, over every growing and living thing that came up out of the soil, was named Demeter. And Demeter was, in those days, a goddess entirely without sorrow. Wherever she walked, the fields bore fruit without ceasing. The grain grew tall and heavy in every season, and no field, anywhere in the world, ever lay bare or hungry, because Demeter's own heart, full and untroubled, poured itself out into the earth without limit. And at the center of that endless, unbroken warmth was her only daughter, a young goddess named Persephone, who was, in her own way, spring itself given a human shape, quick and lovely and utterly beloved, not only by her mother, but by every god on Olympus who had ever seen her laugh among the flowers of the meadow. The old poets gave her a second name, almost as commonly used as her first, Kori, which means, simply, the maiden or the girl, as though her identity in those early years was not yet fully her own, but was still, in some sense, an extension of her mother's endless and generous nature. She was spring's promise. Before spring had ever needed proving, joy without the shadow of grief, yet, cast across it, the purest possible expression of a world that had never once had reason to doubt that tomorrow would be exactly as gentle as today. Persephone's days, in this golden and untroubled age, were spent much as any young goddess might wish to spend them, wandering the wide, sunlit meadows of the earth with the daughters of the sea and the daughters of the rivers, her friends and companions, gathering wildflowers, singing, simply existing in a world that had never yet given her any reason to be afraid of it. It is worth pausing here for a moment on the sheer, unclouded innocence the old stories give her in these early scenes, because everything that follows depends on how completely that innocence is about to be shattered. She was not a queen yet. She was not a figure of the underworld, or of judgment, or of authority over the dead. She was simply a young goddess, gathering flowers in a field on what should have been an entirely ordinary afternoon. She wandered those meadows the way any young and beloved daughter might, gathering violets and irises and the soft, drooping heads of hyacinth, weaving them absent-mindedly into garlands as she walked and talked with her companions, the daughters of ocean and of the great rivers of the world, who had known her since she was a child, small enough to be carried on her mother's shoulder. There was no fence around that meadow. There had never needed to be one. In a world where every living thing bent naturally toward kindness, the idea that a daughter needed watching over, the way a mortal parent might watch a child near a cliff's edge, would have seemed, to Demeter, faintly absurd. But that afternoon was not ordinary at all, because it had already, unbeknownst to Persephone or to her mother, been arranged from above. Hades, the god of the underworld, the silent and solitary brother of Zeus, who ruled alone over the vast kingdom of the dead, had seen Persephone from his shadowed realm below, and had been struck, as gods so often are in these old stories, by a sudden and consuming desire to make her his own. He went to his brother Zeus, king of all the gods, and asked for Persephone's hand in marriage. And Zeus, who was after all Persephone's father as well as Hades's brother, gave his consent. But he did not tell Demeter. He knew, perhaps, exactly how she would answer if she were ever given the chance to refuse. And so the entire arrangement was made quietly, between two brothers, high above the world, while the one mother who would be most affected by it was told nothing at all. There is something worth noticing in this silence, something the old storytellers surely intended us to sit with, rather than pass over quickly. Hades ruled the dead, a kingdom no one else wished to govern, and had done so faithfully, without complaint, since the very division of the cosmos after the war against the Titans. He had never once asked Zeus for anything before. And Zeus, perhaps out of some genuine fondness for a brother who so rarely asked for favors, or perhaps simply because it was easier to grant a request than to face the fury of a mother who would surely have refused it, chose to arrange his own daughter's fate as though she were a piece of property to be quietly reassigned between two households, rather than a person whose own wishes might have mattered at all. And so, on an afternoon indistinguishable, at first, from any other, Persephone wandered a little further from her companions than she usually did, drawn by the sight of a single flower unlike any she had ever seen before, a narcissus, blooming alone, more beautiful and more fragrant than anything in the meadow around it, planted there, some of the old tellings say, deliberately, by the earth itself, at the request of Zeus, as a lure to draw her away from her friends. She reached down to pick it, and as her fingers closed around the stem, the ground beneath her simply opened, splitting apart, with a sound like the whole world cracking in half, and up from that chasm rose Hades himself, in a chariot drawn by coal-black horses, moving faster than thought. He seized her, and before she could so much as cry out to the companions, standing only a few steps away, the earth closed again above them, sealing the two of them, and Persephone's own scream, entirely beneath the surface of the world. It is said that her cry carried, for one brief instant, through every valley, and across every sea in the world, heard faintly by mountains and by the depths of the ocean alike, before it was swallowed entirely by the closing earth, as though creation itself paused just for a moment to register that something irreversible had happened, before continuing on as if nothing at all was wrong. Her friends turned at the sound of the ground splitting and found only a scattered handful of flowers and a hush that seemed, in that instant, to fall across the entire meadow. Far above, on the heights of Olympus, Demeter felt it before she understood it, a sudden and inexplicable chill, a wrongness in the pattern of the world that she, more than any other god, was tuned to feel instantly, the way a mother, even from another room, can sometimes simply know when her child has cried out. She called for Persephone, and no answer came. She searched the halls of Olympus, and then the meadows below, and then, growing more frantic with every hour that passed, the whole wide earth itself, and still there was nothing. No daughter, no trace, no explanation, only an aching, unbearable silence where her only child should have been. For 9 full days and 9 full nights, the old stories tell us, Demeter searched without pause, without food, without rest, carrying 2 flaming torches through the darkness so that she might see even into the deepest valleys and the darkest caves, calling her daughter's name across a world that simply would not answer her. She questioned every god and every mortal she passed, and each of them, in turn, could offer her nothing, for the abduction had been carried out so swiftly and so completely in secret that not even the other Olympians, occupied with their own affairs high above the world, had noticed a single goddess go missing from among them. She crossed mountains without resting. She waded through rivers, still fully dressed in her mourning robes, and passed through cities where mortals, seeing only a desperate woman calling out a name into the dark, offered her water and a place to sit, never once guessing that the goddess responsible for every meal they would ever eat was walking unrecognized through their own streets. It was an old woman on the 10th day who finally gave her the first true word of what had happened. The goddess Hecate, keeper of crossroads and of things hidden in darkness, who had heard, though not seen, the cry that rose up from the earth on that terrible afternoon. Together, Demeter and Hecate went to Helios, the sun, who sees everything that happens beneath his light in the course of his daily journey across the sky. And it was Helios who told her, plainly and without softening it, the whole truth. Persephone had not wandered off, and she had not been lost by any accident. She had been taken by Hades, with the full knowledge and consent of Zeus himself, her own father, and carried down into the kingdom of the dead to become its queen. Helios, in telling her this, did not do so unkindly. He even offered, in some versions of the story, a strange sort of comfort, reminding Demeter that Hades was, whatever else could be said of him, no small or unworthy match for her daughter, a great god in his own right, brother to Zeus himself, ruling absolutely over 1/3 of the entire created universe. It was the kind of comfort that only makes a grieving parent's fury burn hotter, for it treated as a matter of rank and honor what Demeter could only feel as a theft. There are few moments in all of Greek mythology as quietly devastating as this one, and it is worth sitting with it a moment longer than the old poets sometimes allowed themselves to. Demeter's grief was not only for the loss of her daughter. It was for the discovery that the loss had been permitted, arranged even by the very structures of power she had always trusted to protect what she loved most. The world she had believed she understood, a world where a mother's love for her child was simply an obvious and unbreakable law, had quietly rearranged itself above her head, without her consent, without so much as a warning, and there was, in that moment, no one higher to appeal to. Zeus himself was the one who had allowed it. In the strict order of that world, a father's authority over a daughter's marriage outranked even a mother's claim to her own child. And Demeter, for all her power over every harvest on earth, found herself, in this one matter, as powerless as any mortal woman whose husband had promised her daughter to a suitor without ever once asking what the girl herself, or her mother, might have wished. Demeter did not return to Olympus to plead her case before the assembled gods, as another goddess might have. She had learned, in the space of 10 sleepless days, exactly how little her voice counted for in that golden hall when the matter concerned only a mother and a daughter, and so she chose, instead, to remove herself entirely from that world, and to carry her grief down among mortals, where at least her sorrow would not have to compete with the comfortable indifference of gods, who had already moved on to other concerns. Demeter's response to this betrayal was not rage, at least not at first, or not only rage. It was withdrawal. She turned away from Olympus entirely, shedding her divine radiance, and wandered the earth disguised as an old woman, worn and grieving, indistinguishable from any mortal widow walking the roads of Greece. She came, in this disguise, to the city of Eleusis, and there, sitting by a well in her sorrow, she was found by the daughters of the local king, who, moved by pity for the old woman who seemed so overcome with grief, brought her into their household as a nurse for their infant brother, a boy named Demeter. And it was here, in this quiet mortal household, entirely unaware that they were harboring a goddess in mourning, that something strange and tender began to unfold. The household of Eleusis welcomed her with a warmth that owed nothing to rank or recognition, and everything to simple human decency. A stool offered by the well, a cup of barley water, and mint sweetened with kindness rather than obligation. A place by the hearth for a stranger who seemed to carry some private sorrow too large to ask about directly. It is worth noticing that the first true comfort Demeter received in this entire story came not from any god, who had access to every power in the universe, and chose not to use it on her behalf, but from an ordinary mortal family, who had nothing to offer her except their attention and their table. Demeter, grateful for the family's kindness, and perhaps finding in the care of this small mortal child some faint echo of the daughter she had lost, began to secretly try to make the infant, Demeter, immortal, anointing him with ambrosia by day, and holding him gently in the embers of the hearth fire each night, burning away, piece by piece, his mortal nature. It might have worked, and the child might have been granted eternal life, had his mother not one night crept in and witnessed the strange sight of an old woman holding her infant son in the flames, and screamed in terror, breaking the spell before it could be completed. Demeter, her disguise and her secret, both shattered in the same instant, revealed her true and terrible glory to the household, and though she could no longer make the boy immortal, she commanded that a great temple be built in her honor at Eleusis, where, in the centuries that followed, sacred rites in her name would be practiced that promised their initiates a gentler passage through death itself, one of the strange and lasting gifts, we might notice, that grew directly out of her grief. Those rites, later known throughout the Greek world as the Eleusinian mysteries, would go on to be practiced in near total secrecy for over 1,000 years, drawing initiates from every corner of the Mediterranean, from emperors to slaves, all of them sworn never to reveal exactly what they witnessed within those walls. What survives of their reputation is this much: those who took part were said to face their own death, ever after, without the same crushing fear that haunts most mortals, as though Demeter, in the depths of her own grief, had discovered something true about loss that she chose, deliberately, to pass on as a comfort to anyone willing to seek it out. But even this temple, even this brief, tender interruption in her mourning, could not touch the deeper wound at the center of it. Demeter returned to her sorrow, and this time her sorrow began to reach far beyond herself. For Demeter was not merely a grieving mother. She was the goddess upon whom the entire fertility of the earth depended, and as her grief deepened and hardened into something closer to refusal, she made a decision as vast and as terrible, in its own way, as anything Hades or Zeus had done to provoke it. She would let nothing grow. Not one seed would sprout. Not one field would bear grain. She turned her back on the whole living world, exactly as the world, in her eyes, had turned its back on her, and the endless spring that had blessed the earth since the beginning of time simply stopped. What followed was not merely sad. It was catastrophic in the truest and most literal sense of that word. The fields of the world, accustomed to Demeter's endless bounty, lay suddenly barren. The oxen strained uselessly against their plows in soil that would not yield a single green shoot. Seeds that farmers had planted in good faith rotted silently in the cold, dead ground, and season after season passed with no harvest at all. Granaries that had once overflowed stood empty by midwinter. Villages that had never known true hunger began to ration what little remained, and then to go without entirely, and the old and the very young, as is always the cruel arithmetic of famine, were the first to be lost to it. Herdsmen watched their livestock grow thin on withered pasture, and even the wild animals of the forest, who had never once competed with mortals for food before, began to starve alongside them. For Demeter's refusal touched every living, growing thing without exception, sparing neither the deserving nor the innocent. Mortals, who depended on the earth's abundance simply to survive, began to starve in numbers too great to ignore. And it is worth noticing, here, something the old Greeks understood with unusual clarity for their time, that this famine was not merely a human tragedy. It was a crisis for the gods themselves. For mortals who starve cannot till fields, or tend flocks, or gather the grain and wine and incense that were burned in sacrifice on the altars of every god on Olympus. A world with no harvest was, in the coldest and most practical terms, a world that could no longer afford to worship the gods at all. The altars of Olympus, once heavy with offerings of grain and honeyed cake, and the fat of sacrificed animals, grew bare and cold, and the gods, who fed on the smoke and the smell of those offerings as surely as mortals fed on bread, began for the first time in memory to feel something uncomfortably close to hunger themselves. It is a detail the old poets clearly relished, including, for it meant that Demeter's private grief had, in the end, found the one lever powerful enough to move even the gods who had ignored her. Not their compassion, which they had already shown they could withhold, but their own comfort, which they could not. And so it was this, not simple pity for a grieving mother, but the cold and mounting realization that the entire divine order was starving alongside the mortals it depended upon, that finally forced Zeus to act. He sent messenger after messenger down to Demeter, offering gifts, offering honors, offering nearly anything a god could think to offer, and Demeter refused every single one of them with the same unmoved and unbending answer. She wanted only one thing. She wanted her daughter returned to her, whole and unharmed, and until that happened not one blade of grass would rise anywhere on the earth, whatever the cost to gods or to mortals alike. It is a remarkable thing when you sit with it that a single mother's grief was powerful enough to bring the entire machinery of the cosmos, gods and mortals both, to the very edge of ruin, simply by refusing, absolutely and without exception, to keep pretending that everything was fine. Iris, swift messenger of the rainbow, was sent first, gliding down in her many-colored splendor, to plead the case of Olympus, and was turned away without a single word of reply. Every god who valued fertility or plenty or simple abundance was sent after her in turn, each bearing some new gift or honor, and each of them found the same unmoved, unbending woman sitting in her self-imposed exile, unwilling to trade her daughter's freedom for any comfort the rest of the universe could offer her. Zeus, faced with a famine that threatened to unmake the world entirely, at last relented and sent Hermes, the swift messenger of the gods, down into the underworld itself to command Hades to release Persephone back into her mother's keeping. And Hades, who ruled, we should remember, over a kingdom he could not simply abandon, and who was, whatever else might be said of him, bound like every god to obey the will of Zeus, when it was given as a direct command, agreed to let her go. But before Persephone climbed back up into the light of the world above, Hades did one small, and, on its surface, entirely generous thing. He offered her a few seeds from a pomegranate to eat on the long journey home, so that she would not travel hungry. We should pause, too, to imagine what those months below had actually held for Persephone, because the old stories, in their eagerness to reach the famine and the famous seeds, sometimes rush past them too quickly. She had been taken from a world of endless light into a kingdom of permanent gray twilight, ruled by a husband she had never chosen, surrounded by the silent drifting shades of the dead rather than the laughing companions of her meadow. And yet the old poets are careful, even here, not to paint those months as pure horror. Hades, whatever the manner of her taking, is never once shown treating her with cruelty once she was there. He gave her, in time, a throne of her own and a genuine share of his authority. And there are tellings that suggest something between them that, however it began, had grown by the time of her release into a companionship neither one of them entirely wished to sever. It is worth pausing on this moment more carefully than the story usually allows us to, because everything that follows hinges on it. There was an old and unbending law of that underworld kingdom, understood by every soul that had ever crossed into it. Whoever eats the food of the dead can never fully, entirely leave the land of the dead again. Whether Hades offered that fruit knowing exactly what it would bind her to, or whether it was, as some of the old tellings insist, an honest and unthinking kindness from a god unused to showing kindness at all, the old poets leave carefully unresolved, and perhaps that ambiguity is itself the point. What we do know is this: Persephone offered a way to refuse that fruit entirely, and fully aware, as any queen of that realm would have to be, of the old law binding anyone who tasted the food of the dead, chose to eat it anyway. Whether that choice was made from simple hunger after months of fasting in protest of her own captivity, or from some quieter and more complicated part of her that was not entirely certain, she wished to leave that kingdom behind. Forever, the old poets leave for us to decide, and every generation since has decided it a little differently. She took 6 small seeds from that fruit and ate them, and in that act, small as it seems, the entire shape of her future, and the future of every year that would ever follow, was decided. For when Persephone returned to the world above, and Demeter, weeping with a joy as vast as her grief had been, ran to embrace the daughter she had feared, lost forever, the first question she asked, even before the embrace was finished, was whether Persephone had eaten anything at all in that dark kingdom below. It is a small, sharp detail worth noticing, that even in the very first instant of a reunion she had ached for, across so many barren months, Demeter's instinct as a mother was still to search immediately for the one hidden danger that might yet take her daughter away again. Grief of that depth, the old stories seem to suggest, does not simply vanish the moment its cause is resolved. It leaves behind a permanent, watchful edge, a mother's readiness to ask the hard question first, and celebrate only afterward. And when Persephone admitted hesitantly to the 6 pomegranate seeds, Demeter's joy was pierced through, instantly, with a new and different sorrow, for she understood at once what her daughter, in her hunger or in her confusion, had unknowingly bound herself to. For one terrible instant, the whole joy of the reunion threatened to collapse back into the very grief it had just replaced, as Demeter realized that the daughter standing before her, whole and breathing and alive, was not, after all, fully and permanently hers to keep. Because she had tasted the food of the dead, Persephone could not remain forever in the world of the living. She belonged, now in part, to that other kingdom as well. And a compromise, worked out at last by Zeus himself, divided her year between the 2 worlds she now called home. It was, in its way, the first true compromise Zeus had offered in this entire affair, and it is worth noticing that it came only after every other option had been exhausted. After messengers had been refused, after gifts had been declined, after an entire world had nearly starved itself into ruin. Zeus, who had once arranged his daughter's fate without a single word to her mother, was finally forced to sit down and negotiate an outcome that satisfied no one completely, but that at least allowed the world to keep turning. Even the king of the gods, it seems, eventually meets a grief he cannot simply overrule. For 6 months, 1 month for every seed she had eaten, Persephone would live below with Hades as queen of that silent kingdom. And for the other 6 months, she would rise back up into the light and dwell with her mother among the living, exactly as she once had. Hermes himself was given the task of guiding her back up along that road between the 2 kingdoms, and it is said that as they climbed, Hades watched her go, in a silence the old poets choose not to fill with words, whether of relief or grief or some complicated mixture of both, a god who ruled absolutely over everything, except the one heart he had never quite managed to fully possess. And so it is that we finally arrive at the answer the Greeks were reaching for all along, when Persephone descends each year to take her place once more beside Hades. Demeter's grief returns with her, and the goddess of the harvest, mourning her daughter's absence, exactly as she did on that very first terrible day, lets the fields grow cold and bare and unyielding. Farmers across Greece, long before they had any word for the science of it, understood this rhythm as a kind of sacred agreement rather than a misfortune to be dreaded. They timed their sowing and their harvest to the goddess's private sorrow and joy, as reliably as sailors timed their voyages to the stars, and the great cycle of planting became, in this way, not merely a practical calendar, but a yearly act of shared mourning and shared celebration with a mother whose grief the whole world had agreed long ago to carry alongside her. This is the season we call autumn, sliding down into winter, the world itself withholding its warmth and sympathy with a mother's private sorrow. But when the 6 months pass, and Persephone climbs back up into the sunlight to be reunited with her mother once again, Demeter's joy floods back into the earth exactly as it once did in that first age before sorrow existed at all, and the frozen ground softens, and the green returns, and the whole world comes alive again with her. This is spring. This is the reason, the old stories tell us, that the year must always be divided in 2, not as a punishment, but as the visible yearly echo of one family's private grief and one family's private joy, written large enough across the sky and the soil that every living thing on earth has learned, without ever quite realizing it, to move to its rhythm. Even now, in the depths of a modern winter, far removed from any altar or any ancient rite, there remains something quietly true in the old shape of this story, that the bare trees and the frozen ground are not evidence of the world's abandonment, but evidence of its ongoing love, paused rather than ended, waiting only for the appointed month to return in full. There is a deeper transformation in this story, too, one that is easy to overlook beneath the simple beauty of the changing seasons, and it is worth lingering on before we close, because it is perhaps the truest gift the myth has to offer. Persephone did not remain forever. The frightened young goddess who was pulled screaming into the earth on an ordinary afternoon among the flowers. In her time below, she became something more, a queen in her own right, seated beside Hades with real authority over that vast and silent kingdom, consulted by the dead, respected even by the fiercest spirits of that realm, a figure of genuine power rather than simple captivity. Mortals who prayed to her in later ages did not address her only as the lost daughter of Demeter. They addressed her as a queen, capable of granting mercy to the dead, capable of hearing a plea that even Hades himself might refuse, a figure powerful enough that the greatest heroes of Greece, when they had reason to travel down into that kingdom themselves, learned to direct their prayers to her as often as to her husband. The girl who was pulled screaming into the earth over a single flower had become, by the time her story was fully told, one of the two great powers a living soul most needed to petition on the day of their own death. The old stories in their later and more considered tellings do not ask us to see her only as a victim of that first terrible day. They ask us to see a young goddess who was taken into the deepest darkness that exists, and who did not merely survive it, but grew within it into someone capable of ruling it. This, perhaps, is the quiet second lesson hidden inside a myth that is usually remembered only for explaining why the leaves fall. It is not only that life returns after winter the way spring reliably follows the cold. It is that something transformed can come back different and larger than it was before it went down into the dark at all. Persephone is not merely spring, restored each year exactly as it was. She is spring that has also known winter intimately, from the inside, and carries some of that knowledge back up into the light with her every single year, which may be why the flowers that follow her return always seem, to those who have grieved something themselves, so much more precious than flowers that had never once had to be missed. It is worth remembering, too, that the very flower which first drew her from the meadow, the narcissus planted, some say, as a deliberate lure, continues to bloom each year in that same brief window between winter's end and full spring, as though the earth itself still marks the exact moment of her disappearance, and her return with the one bloom that began it all, a small, quiet reminder woven permanently into the calendar of every living season. And so we return, at the end, to the question this whole story was built to answer. Why must the world die a little every single year before it can live again? Perhaps because grief and joy, in the deepest order of things, were never meant to be separated cleanly from one another at all. A world of endless spring, the kind Demeter once poured out over the earth without limit, sounds, at first, like paradise. But the Greeks who told this story seemed to understand something subtle about a joy that never once has to be interrupted, that it can, in time, become almost invisible, taken so completely for granted that no one thinks to notice it at all. It was only after the world had known true winter, true absence, true hunger, that spring became something worth celebrating each and every year, rather than simply the permanent, unremarkable backdrop of an unbroken life. Loss, this myth quietly insists, is what teaches us to recognize abundance when it returns. and there is a final, gentler comfort tucked into the very structure of the compromise itself, easy to miss beneath the sorrow of it. 6 months is not forever. Every winter Demeter has ever grieved through has come with an ending already written into it, a fixed and certain date on which her daughter climbs back up into the light. Grief in this story, however real, is never once presented as endless. It is only ever a season, patiently endured, on the way back around to joy. Perhaps a mother's love, and the sorrow that shadows it whenever what she loves is out of her sight, is simply woven into the very shape of the seasons, so that every falling leaf carries an echo of Demeter's grief, and every first green shoot of spring carries an echo of her joy at her daughter's return. The Greeks did not experience winter as an enemy to be defeated, or as evidence that the world was broken. They experienced it as evidence that the world was loved, deeply and continuously, by a mother who could not help but let her sorrow show, and who could not help, either when the time came, letting her joy show even more brightly for it. Rest now in this quiet turning of the year. Whatever season you find yourself in tonight, in your own life, trust that the story does not end there. The dark half of the year has never once, in all of human memory, failed to give way to the light. And somewhere, even now, a mother and a daughter are moving steadily back toward one another, exactly as they have every single year since the world was young.